Today we're going to look into the strange events which started on the 27th of January 1956. The location is 63 Wycliffe Street in Battersea, London. Nothing stood out about this terraced house, but behind the doors of number 63, a story still resonates long after it was torn down in the 1960s. This particular story was national news. It was talked about in Parliament, and it all began with a silver key found on the bed of 15-year-old Shirley Hitchings. She was the daughter of Wally and Kitty Hitchings. The former was a train driver, the latter suffered from chronic arthritis and was wheelchair-bound. John Hitchings was Shirley's adopted brother. He was in his 20s and worked as a surveyor for the local council. The last of the occupants was Ethel, Shirley's grandmother. She was an imposing 6'4" and weighed 250 pounds. She was outspoken and quite the presence. At the time of the events to be spoken of, she had been slowed by a stroke. As stated, events began when Shirley came across an old ornate silver key with intricate designs on her pillow. She had never seen it before, but was intrigued by its strange appearance. Naturally, she wanted to know where it had come from, so she asked her father if he knew anything about it. At the time, he was bathing Shirley's mother, who, because of her illness, was unable to do so. He told Shirley to leave the key on the mantelpiece and he would have a look at it when he could. After tending to Kitty, he walked to the mantelpiece. There was no key there, and he asked Shirley where it had gone. She didn't know. It was soon found by Shirley in the same place she had found it, on her pillow. Wally asked if she had put it back. She replied no. Though thinking it strange, Wally decided to find out where it had come from. So he went about the house, trying the key on every lock, including an old chest left by the previous occupant. The key didn't fit any. The household put it down as an odd, unexplained find and nothing more. But it was that night the events began. The household was woken to banging coming from inside the walls. John, being familiar with buildings, attempted to find a source. None could be found. The reverberations seemed to emanate from, in the words of Shirley, everywhere. Wally and John determined it wasn't the pipes, so they made the decision to enter the attic. While up there, the doorbell rang. It was a number of neighbours asking to find out what was causing all the commotion. They blamed it on Wally, but while remonstrating with him, they heard the noises and quickly realised that none of the occupants of number 63 had anything to do with them. Some thought it was a structural problem, others thought it was possibly a less than careful home invader, and some simply stood baffled. When the police arrived, they brushed it off as the doings of hoaxers. Yet the family were adamant they had nothing to do with the events, and they had neighbours who could verify this. Dumbfounded, the only link they could make was with the key that had been found. A search began for the item, but it was nowhere to be found, and all the occupants denied having moved it. What was more disconcerting is the fact that the noise continued every night for 2 weeks, both upstairs and downstairs, in the ceiling and walls. Soon after, chairs began moving, and whatever was said to be interfering with the objects in Wycliffe Street began focusing on one of the house's members, Shirley Hitchings. One character who must be looked at in more detail in order to get a better understanding of the case is a man called Harold Chibit. He was in many ways eccentric and had an entrenched belief in an afterlife, which seems to have been instigated during his period of service in the First World War. Throughout the day he was a tax collector, at night he spent large amounts of time researching paranormal activity, even going so far as to sleep in the living rooms and kitchens of people seeking answers to unexplainable phenomena. Because of his past unorthodox investigations, he was called in by the Hitchings family to examine and detail the activities experienced. He arrived 6 weeks after the key was found on Shirley's pillow. He would take up position on the kitchen floor for a good many nights, with nothing more than a sleeping bag, a pen, and some notebooks to document any happening experienced by himself and other family members, especially Shirley. These notebooks exist to this day and were last in the possession of a BBC podcast team looking into the case. Shirley, who is now in her 80s, continues to relay her story to documentary makers, authors, and most extensively to the BBC podcast team just mentioned. She tells of ornaments, pots and pans, and a range of other household items floating slowly or quickly across rooms in the house. Sometimes it would appear as though the entity was placing them down on the floor. At other times, it looked as if they were aimed at her, and sometimes they were violently hurled against walls. A disconcerting memory is seeing her father's slippers, always located beside the fireplace, walk unembodied across the room. John Hitchings was the skeptic of the family. When interviewed by Harold Chibit, he stated that Shirley was responsible for the strange phenomena. From his position, things went quiet when she wasn't around. There was no strange activity. It was her that found the key, and it was Shirley who witnessed most of the objects floating, flying, or being hurled against walls. And it was Shirley who named the entity Donald. Chibit believed that John was right in part. Most, if not all, major events happened when Shirley was present. Chibit was sure that Shirley was the focus. She was the person the entity was feeding off. This seemed to be confirmed when John told him the following. John said that there were things he saw that he couldn't explain. One night the family went to her room after they heard screaming coming from Shirley. John stated the following. It was like her bedsheet was being pulled off her. She was screaming for her dad's help. John asked Shirley to show him her hands, thinking this was a staged hoax. She did raise her hands above the sheets, only for the sheet beneath to wriggle free from its position too. When it made it halfway down, that's when it happened. Her back was arched rigid. It was like she was hovering, floating, maybe 6 inches over the bed. Accounts of strange events soon got to the media. Journalists, photographers and radio men came to get first-hand accounts from the family. On leaving her house, Shirley was inundated with questions and overwhelmed by the flashing of cameras. For a while it led to her becoming a prisoner in her own home. Eventually the family decided that the only way to get rid of the press was to invite some reporters in. While interviewing Shirley and the family, they were told of the moving objects and communication with Donald. They told reporters that a form of communication had been devised. When questions were asked, a reply would come in the form of taps on the wall. 1 tap meant no, and 2 meant yes. The 2 reporters asked if they could communicate with the entity. They were told they could. A reporter from the South London Advertiser asked simply, "Are you there?" There was a 2-tap reply in the presence of all. The second question was, "Are you evil?" There was a reply of 1 knock. The third question was, "Do you mean Shirley any harm?" Once again, the response was 1 knock. The fourth question was posed by a reporter at the Daily Mail. He said, "Can we help you in any way?" 2 knocks were heard in response. The questions continued in a similar vein, but then they thought to ask the entity, "How old is Shirley?" 15 knocks were heard. The last question was, "Will you go away?" The response was 3 interspersed knocks, which were interpreted to be the reply, "No, no, no." With the unwanted visitor seemingly set to stay, Wally, Shirley's father, grew more and more wary about the events. He was told to take time off from his job as the strain began to show, and it was this noticeable nervous tension that led one of his colleagues, Harry Hanks, a man with supposed psychic abilities, to take an interest in the events on Wycliffe Road. The idea he presented to the family was to exorcise the spirit, and they agreed. When the day came, the press were invited, though this was done by Harry Hanks without the permission of the family. Shirley describes that night as traumatic. She describes chants from Wally, contortions of the face, and the light in the room was pulsing. She says Harry claimed to have channeled the entity who told him he wanted Shirley. While the proceedings continued, there was a knock at the front door. Mrs. Hanks, Harry's wife, went to answer it. The remaining individuals in the sitting room heard a commotion. When she returned, she told them it was the police, who came because they had a report of black magic, and accused Harry Hanks of summoning the devil. It turned out that a member of the press had tipped them off. The story even went so far as to be mentioned in Parliament, where an MP made allegations regarding black magic. Some, including a local MP, accused the police of mishandling the case and asked for a public apology. The Home Secretary, Gwilym Lloyd George, was also asked to condemn the actions of the police, but he refused to do so on the grounds that black magic was a crime against common law. Later in the year, a newspaper would accuse Shirley of being responsible for the noises being put on Donald. They said that Shirley had a deformity in the toe which allowed her to make tapping noises unnoticed. We will come back to this later. Rather than just tapping and banging, the actions of Donald began to increase when fire began taking hold spontaneously. One thing we do know is that fires definitely took place. The Daily Express reports that the fire brigade reported the happenings. A daylight fire finally impacted one of the residency's occupants, Shirley's father Wally. It happened when his bed was set on fire and he received injuries. The doctors noticed that the injuries were not just burns. In the middle of the burn, there was quite a deep gouge, which the doctor said came from claws. What we don't know is if it was Donald or other members of the house. Was Shirley going to extreme lengths to maintain her story that she was being harassed by an unwanted spirit? The evidence to the contrary is to say that the firefighters could find no evidence that the fire was started by a person or persons. We also have to account for the gouge marks noted by the doctor, which were said to have been present within the burn. As we've already said, there were times when Donald would use tapping noises in response to questions, but later in this strange case, he would communicate when Harold Chibit began pointing to letters and waiting for taps in response, indicating the correct one. After a period of time, letters were found, which though childlike, were legible. Some of the letters revolved around Donald's interest in Shirley. Others requested items which he wished to have for the upcoming Christmas, and others gave details as to who he was. Let's talk about the supposed identity first. He claimed to be, and I quote, the long-dead son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. This was apparently revealed while utilising the letter pointing, but soon letters began to appear around the house. Come the end of December, nearly a year after the first strange events began, the violent outburst said to have come from Donald had subsided, while the communications intensified. The letters found were made up of curled capital letters, the contents of which were strewn with spelling mistakes and the occasional French word. Rather than referring to Shirley by her name, he called her Renee. Here is a transcript of one of the letters, said to have come from the 6th of December. Donald requested materials for Christmas decorations the following Monday. There was also more information given through letters with regards to his supposed French and aristocratic background. He also added the following. Essentially, this unwanted visitor was claiming to be the Dauphin, son of the executed Louis XVI. Apparently, he escaped over the English Channel by ship. His ship apparently sank in 1795, and he would have been 10 at the time. The front room by this time had become known as Donald's room, and family members would claim he would tap along to TV theme tunes that he liked, and letters began to appear addressed to some of the stars in these shows. One of the stars was Jeremy Spencer, and Donald warned that his life might be in danger. He again wrote a letter, which he asked the family to mail to Jeremy, warning him of an impending accident. As well as an apparent liking for certain TV shows, he also developed an animosity to Ethel, the grandmother. She continued to see him as a product of the devil. Some of the messages sent about her are vindictive but comical. Here is one sent to Wally.
Wally for Nana disobeyment. Tip her out of the bed. Silly old bugger. She's old battle axe, with a face like an overgrown beetroot.
The more vindictive side was always close by, as Donald's animosity towards the elderly Ethel became ever more hostile. One night a message was tapped out on the wall, Shirley interpreted as meaning "Get Ethel." When she came, objects began to fly around and there was whispering heard. Eventually, a disembodied voice was heard. It was female in tone and distinctly Irish in sound. On asking whose voice it was, the reply came back,
"Sarah, I need to speak to Ethel."
Ethel replied, "How do I know it's you?" The voice replied, "I have a message for you." The family can remember Ethel being deeply disturbed by the event. Sarah was the name of Ethel's mother, and the voice was said to have been that of her mother's. Shirley has said that her grandmother never recovered from that night. She shut herself up in her room, rarely came down to watch TV as she usually did, and a few months later, Shirley would arrive home on a Friday night to find an ambulance outside the now infamous house. Ethel had had another stroke. Shirley followed her into the ambulance and says her grandmother told her she wouldn't be coming home to them. She was resigned to her death. On the Saturday morning, police arrived to tell them her grandmother had died. Harold Chibit had become a part of the furniture in his attempt to find out what was causing all the activity at 63 Wycliffe Street. His notes give off the impression that he is honest and truly believes he is communicating with non-material entities. However, for someone like me, the previously mentioned information points towards an elaborate hoax. We've all seen TV programs, watched YouTube clips, and read some articles about haunting and poltergeist activity, but the idea that a disembodied ghost has now reached the level of being able to communicate through letters in such a familiar way raises more than a few questions. Chibit appears to have believed this was credible, but his faith was shaken when some names that Donald had apparently linked to the London theatre scene on Drury Lane were found by Harold's wife Lily in a Radio Times magazine dated to March 1956. He notes his possible foolishness in notebook entries, and the BBC podcast team looked in more detail at the authenticity of Shirley's accounts. The first thing they did was compare writing samples of Shirley's against those meant to have been written by Donald. The first thing the handwriting expert said was that the handwriting was highly embellished. There was a lot of curlicues, and this often signifies an attempt to conceal the true writer's identity through artifice. When comparing Shirley and the supposed letters of Donald's, she says the following: "Shirley, like Donald, has a severe left slant, and there are very wide spaces between the words. In fact, there are quite wide spaces between the letters. This is somebody who doesn't feel as though they are part of a group. They would come across as being friendly and sociable, but the reality is far from it, and they feel themselves very isolated." With regards to Donald's letter, she says, "I think this letter is highly stylised, but I think that again there's artifice, spelling mistakes, there's transposing of letters, there's franglais, going between French and English. It's almost somebody showing off their bilingual abilities. It's a scream for attention." On being asked if she believes the handwriting in both letters is from the same person, she states, "I would say they almost certainly are. The chances of both these letters being written by different people are remote enough for me to say that I'm certain they've been written by the same writer." So we have an expert that is saying they are from the same person. I personally find this convincing, but I'm also aware that handwriting experts have come under some rough criticism in criminal cases over the past 2 decades. And I have to say, I'm a little sceptical about a handwriting expert who claims she can create a profile from the separation seen in the words and letters. However, on the whole, I lean heavily towards her conclusion. Shirley, when confronted with this conclusion, denies being responsible, while saying that she may have been taken over by the entity, though she says she was never conscious of any takeover. Though Shirley says she may have been writing the letters unconsciously, she also states that she can't understand where she would have had the time to do so. She says she was at work when a lot of the letters were found. She also states that there was always family members around her, especially her mother. Shirley also states that at the height of the deluge, when Harold Chibit was getting 60 letters a day, she was also at work. In all, there were approximately 4,000 letters. Being sceptical about hauntings in general, I do lean towards the idea that this was all a teenage ploy for attention. The letters point in this direction, yet how do we explain the noises so loud neighbours were woken up? How do we explain the interactions reported by journalists and many others involved in the case? Finally, why were so many people taken along with the idea that all this was true? This is a case that went on for 12 years, yet so many people, including family, friends and investigators like Harold Chibit, never really suspected Shirley, not to the degree that they gave up on the case. And when they did come across information that may have led to suspicion, it was always short-lived. Did these numerous people simply want to believe in the ghost? Should they have questioned Shirley or other members of the family, would it have caused an open wound they didn't want to open? We can't say for certain that the rest of the family weren't in on it, but some of the members, including John and Ethel, appear to either try and dispel the activity as hard to explain but explainable if not yet explained, or like Ethel, they are clearly dead set against it. I think the best way of getting to the core of things is by examining some of the things noted by Chibit. One thing that is quite clear from them is that he was not someone who blindly believed in Shirley. This is observed by the BBC podcast presenter in possession of the notebooks he kept. One passage from the notebook states the following: "At first sight, it looks as though fraud was operated here." He was sure that there were some things that Shirley feigned. However, he also says this must be seen in relation to the whole case, which is a strange mixture of the apparently genuine and false. In the notebooks, we see a sincere effort to catch Shirley out. For example, he would take a key home with him, which was the only one available to enter a certain room. When he returned the following day and unlocked the door, the letters would be lying in wait. There is no doubt in many ways Shirley could have got around this though. She could have picked locks, though I don't know how difficult it would be to lock it again once this has been achieved. She may also have had a copy of the key that he wasn't aware of. Once again, we can't be certain. If it was a fraud, it was a fraud on a huge level. The activity would continue until 1968. It would become less frequent after they left the Wycliffe address in 1964, but it would follow to their new address, though it became much less frequent. Shirley also continued to experience unnatural events, so she says, even after getting married in 1965. One theory laid out by psychologist Ciarán O'Keefe was that one background figure may have been responsible. That person is John. The reasons he gives are as follows. He distrusts John's reaction. If these things described were happening, how could he remain so sceptical? He also points out that it's John deflecting the blame onto Shirley when the activity begins. He points out that we don't know what the relationship between Shirley and John was like. John was probably the only person who had access to an ornate key. After all, he worked in the building trade. Lastly, he may have developed an animosity towards the family for one reason in particular. Up until he was 18, he thought he was the son of Ethel. When he was called up for national service, he discovered he wasn't the son of Ethel when the RAF asked for birth certificates. Shirley says he was distraught at the news. Evelyn Hollow, who also took part in the podcast series, finds flaws in this argument. She points out that it wouldn't have been possible for John to have created the noises heard by neighbours. He was also there when they were being interviewed by reporters. These very reporters hear sounds which would at first sound as if they were coming from inside the table. They would then move from wall to wardrobe to ceiling, all while John is sitting down. The noises also happen while Shirley is at work when John is nowhere near. So we'll let you decide. Go and have a look at the case yourself. There's so much information we couldn't include, so if there's anything else you find, let us know in the comments. Once again, thanks to everyone for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please do make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Mystery Scope. As always, until the next time, take care.